But if you're selling into medtech, fintech, manufacturing, logistics, especially the more traditional the industry, the more important trust becomes. The more traditional, the more complex, and the more risky the industry, the more trust plays a factor. The more trust plays a factor, the higher the bar for localization and expansion is.
Welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast, where experts discuss international content management, product localization, and global expansion. I'm Katerina from Undertow. We create and manage localization programs for B2B SaaS companies so they can grow globally. Today, our founder Nicola Calabrese will be talking with Ferdinand Goetzen, co-founder of the Growth Syndicate, a full-service B2B marketing agency and a marketing leader who has helped scale companies like Recruitee and 3D Hubs into Germany, France, and beyond. Ferdinand has spent years helping B2B SaaS companies turn international expansion into a real growth lever. In this conversation, he shares how to pick the right markets, when to invest in localization, and how to avoid the most common and the most expensive mistakes when going global. Get ready for stories and power-packed tips on validating new markets, reading local trust dynamics, and building a phased expansion that actually works. So, without further ado, let's dive in.
Hello, Ferdinand, and welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing good, Nicola. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's really nice to have you here. And today we're going to talk about international expansion, as usual, and specifically about how to choose the right markets to enter, what kind of preparation work to do beforehand. But before we jump right into today's topic, would you mind telling our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called the Growth Syndicate. We're a full-service B2B marketing agency. We help companies across kind of strategy, tactics, and operations turn marketing into a real revenue driver, exclusively B2B. And I've basically worked in marketing and commercial leadership positions at B2B tech companies for the better part of the last 10 years. I guess most relevant to today, I helped expand a company called Recruitee into the German market, the French market, and beyond. And I did the same with a company called 3D Hubs. I was the CMO at one, director of marketing at the other. And I've worked with a lot of companies in helping them expand into these markets. Germany and France very often, but also beyond that, Nordics, Europe to the US, US to Europe. So this is something that I've had the chance to try in a lot of different contexts and in a lot of different ways.
What are the key factors that should influence market selection decision, and how do you help company prioritize when evaluating multiple potential markets? So how do you help them choose which ones to enter and in what order, basically?
Yeah, so I think it depends a lot on the context you're operating from. So I'll give a specific example. So I think starting point is that there's certain factors you can choose. So let's start with, if you're selling software and you have a relatively, let's say, English-based international motion, you might already have some signals, right? You might already notice, especially if you're, let's say, a PLG SaaS, or let's say not an enterprise where it's really hunting and big deal sizes, but let's say you have a higher volume of customers, you might already see signals. You might already see, oh, we've got now the third customer from France, or hey, we've had a couple of customers from Poland. So that could often be a starting point for exploration, because already have some basis in place. When we talk about how to actually do these expansions, one of the tricky things, of course, is you need to have use cases, you need to have recognizable logos, you need to have testimonials and social proof from people that the people in that market will recognize. So if you already have signals within your current customer base, that can serve as a good starting point, because you might already have some basis, people to talk to learn about the market and so on and so forth. But sometimes you don't have that. And then it really depends on the angle you take and also the industry you're in. So, for example, when we expanded 3D Hubs, we were in the industrial manufacturing space. So it would make sense to expand into countries with large industries. So Germany was a non-brainer. France was also a no-brainer, because of course, Germany and France have big industries. Italy, one of the biggest industrial countries in Europe. So there was already Poland, also big industry. So you already had within Europe a handful of countries that for that industry were particularly interesting. So if you're in fintech, for example, being in London and the UK is probably a must. If you're in certain industries, certain countries might just be stronger at that industry, and that might be a determining factor. Otherwise, commercial opportunity is, of course, a big one. Markets that operate similarly to the market you're in, that can be a factor, right? So expanding from the Benelux to the Nordics is often not such a huge hassle because very good level of English, similar buying culture, there are differences, but that's often something that's kind of, if you're a UK company testing the Dutch market, you might be able to try and adapt some of those learnings to the Swedish market more easily than you would to the French market. And then there's logistical questions, right? Every market expansion, depending on your product, the use cases, the industry you're in, whether there's logistics involved, it changes the difficulty of expanding into a new market. So that also influences, right? Dutch companies often expand into Germany for a reason because it's right next door. There's a lot of Germans living in the Netherlands. It's easy to hire German-speaking talent, these kind of things. So it's usually one of those factors. So either you have signals or your industry already is predisposed towards certain countries, or there's a specific commercial opportunity, or you just basically have a logistical ease of expansion. Those are some of the factors that I would look at in deciding.
And how do you think competitive landscape what role it plays, and if it might change, let's say, the go-to-market approach, or if there are cases maybe where you recommended not entering a market due to some competitive dynamics?
Yeah, so those are factors to look at as well. Two things here, of course. What is the competitive landscape and what is working for you in your home market, and is that going to work there? Take another specific example. Search was a huge play at 3D Hubs. We ranked top of Google, paid and organic, for 3D printing, CNC machining, all these kind of manufacturing keywords. So when we looked at other countries, we looked at, do they have that same search volume, right? Because we were offering a relatively digitalized solution to a pretty traditional industry. So we needed to know, is there actually demand for this? Are people looking for this online? Because if they're not looking for this online, it's going to be an uphill battle, because then you're not doing digital marketing, you're doing offline marketing, you're doing events, you're doing relationship building, you're doing networking, all valid options, by the way. But it was just from the way that we were set up with a centralized expansion team, just didn't make the most sense for us. So we tried to see, is that tactic translatable? Now, I know you asked about competitors. It's relevant because depending on what you do, no competitors could be a huge opportunity, but it can also be a problem. Because if you're doing something that the country you're moving into has never heard of, you're basically playing a category creation game in a new country. And that's a difficult game to play. It's not impossible, but if you are a, 5 to 10 million or 1 to 10 million ARR SaaS, you probably don't want to play the category creation game in your market expansion. It's just very hard and time consuming. And category creation 9 out of 10 times, even though the biggest stories are about category creation, it's a misnomer. Most of the time, it is not easy to do. So I think competitive landscape is actually a good thing, right? So for us, what we like the fact that there were players in countries like France offering digital manufacturing, because it allowed us to go in and say, hey, we do this too, but we do it better because we're more French than the others, or, whatever, we could play certain cards. The differentiators are important. And there is a point to be said about positioning. Your positioning and strengths in your home market might not be the same positioning and strengths in the market you're expanding to. So an example of this was when I was at Recruitee, we had a bunch of features that we saw as kind of cutting edge features that really differentiated us. And in the Dutch market, those features, they ate them up. But when we moved into the French market, this is almost a decade ago, some of the most basic features, like being able to manage your candidates in a Kanban board, the most basic feature compared to our Dutch competitors was almost a new thing in France. So we'd go to events and French recruiters would be wowed by what we saw as table stakes. It's important to understand the competitive landscape. It's important to be able to differentiate and have that differentiation story and message clear. But I generally think it's better if you have competitors because it means there's a market there. There are exceptions, of course, right? So if you have 3 industries, it's important to understand the competitive landscape. It's important to be able to differentiate and have that differentiation story and message clear. But I generally think it's better if you have competitors because it means there's a market there. There are exceptions, of course, right? So if you have 3 industries, 3 countries you can expand into, and one of them has 10 competitors and one of them has 4, pick the one with 4 maybe, depending on the other factors. But competition presence is usually a good thing in my opinion.
And when you see competition, this is something because that we see as well. What do you think about when entering a market with competition, you sometimes have local competition or competition that is already, let's say, localized. So companies that is from a different country with a presence in that market. Let's say France, for example, you're competing against the French companies and also like companies that are not from France, but they are localizing there. How much do you think that affects the localization approach in the sense like, not only obviously having the website translated and the materials and the, let's say, the app as well, but also like how it is done? How much do you think it makes a difference? And also, let's say, customer success, or if you have a sales motion, having salespeople on the ground that are French, not just French speaking from the headquarters. How much do you think that changes the dynamics in there?
It definitely changes the dynamics. There are countries where you're better off presenting yourself as being from that country, and countries where it doesn't matter. Right. So the Dutch don't really care if you're Dutch. It's not entirely true. I think when you are from that country, when you are from the country you're expanding to, you always have a better, quicker connection. There's always kind of a natural trust that people have in their own people. It's almost this tribal thing. We can talk it away on the surface, but in reality it exists, right? Germans trust German companies, French people trust French companies, and Dutch people trust Dutch companies. But the level of trust and willingness to experiment differs. So I think the Dutch are less connected to the company being Dutch than the Germans are connected to the company being German. So when we would expand it to Germany, we'd want to present ourselves as German. And that changes your strategy. It's a difference between having a centralized localization strategy or boots on the ground. In Germany, you absolutely need to have boots on the ground, but it is very industry dependent. If you're selling SaaS, if you're selling sales software, it doesn't matter so much. Very internationalized audience, you're selling to startups, people don't care there. But if you're selling into medtech, fintech, manufacturing, logistics, especially the more traditional the industry, the more important trust becomes. The more traditional, the more complex, and the more risky the industry, the more trust plays a factor. The more trust plays a factor, the higher the bar for localization and expansion is, right? So if you're selling sales automation software, probably it doesn't matter if there's local players or not. You could probably even use the fact that you're a bigger player, a foreign player. You can maybe even use that to your advantage. The more complex and risky the industry, the harder it is to compete with local players. And there you need to present yourself as a local player, right? So if you're a European player expanding into other European countries, play the European card. If you're a US player expanding into Europe, it becomes harder. Then you need to play the unit economics or the power card. This is the innovative company coming in to show you how it's done. Whatever. Obviously, that would be an arrogant positioning. I wouldn't say it that way, but you need to find the angle that works. So it can be challenging when there's local players, but it depends also how big those players are. And there are still legit ways to differentiate from local players.
And before you mentioned, obviously, some cases where you had features that differentiated you from the other local competitors. What I'm curious to know is, how do you help companies assess early on whether a market requires fundamental changes in the product versus maybe they will just need to do some surface level localization. They don't need to change the product itself so much to adapt to the market. And what's the cost of getting that wrong if that happens?
If you're expanding for the first time, or if you're in your earlier stages of your overall market expansion strategy, you probably don't want to change the product much at all. Like, it's expensive, it's costly. I mean, that's also changing. I mean, let's be honest, AI is changing the entire localization game. There's all kinds of shit that was time consuming and expensive 2 years ago that now can be done pretty well. So that is changing, and some of these principles are changing. So yeah, maybe it's easier than ever to localize your product. Maybe it's easier than ever to build new features. But I still think generally fixing the features is something you do when a market shows significant traction and you want to build that further, or it's something you do when you've already tapped out some of the most obvious markets and you're starting to expand into deeper markets and where you're starting to tap out some of the low-hanging fruit. It's not something I would do at the start. At the start, what you do is you look at your products, you look at the markets you can expand to, you pick the markets where you know you have a competitive edge. So if you're doing it right and you're doing it at the early stage, it's a non-factor because you pick the markets where you can differentiate. If you are trying to grow in a market that already has shown traction, that is not your home market, well, then you might need to start looking into product alterations. But there it comes back to the same way that you make any product decision, right? You look at the opportunity, you look at how many users are potentially affected by it, you look at how many customers you could acquire by fixing it or changing it. But is it affecting closing rates? Is it affecting successful trial conversions? It becomes a feature like every other. So it's not really something that I look as something separate from the rest of the product organization.
Sorry to interrupt your listening, but do you want to grow your B2B SaaS in international markets? Because every country is different, and what users value in one market doesn't necessarily matter in another one. At Undertow, we help B2B SaaS companies like yours succeed in their international expansion. We create customized localization strategies that address the unique challenges of each market. In this way, you can effectively attract, engage, and convert customers worldwide. Visit undertowlanguages.com to find out more. And now back to the show. Yeah, so again, he's looking at how much of an impact we'll have because it's that single market maybe that's going to use that feature. So is it really worth to prioritize maybe to different features as well? I'm thinking about the product backlog as well. Maybe there's features that are more like global. It wouldn't make sense to prioritize just one that has a lower impact because it's going to be a huge impact in that market, but maybe if you're present in several ones. I'm thinking here especially about SaaS that maybe they have a wider presence than maybe other kind of industries.
In reality, a recruiter's job in France is not that different from a recruiter's job in Germany or the Netherlands or Sweden. So this idea that there's going to be this fundamental feature that's going to be super different for a country, it's not that common. There might be situations where you have a player in France who's really good at a certain thing, and so you need to be able to compete there. It's not something I've come across as like super common problem. It's more things like the website is translated to German, but the sign-up flow isn't. And translating the sign-up flow for whatever reason is difficult, especially if you're doing things like e-commerce, then you have things like product descriptions and all these other things, all these kind of logistical descriptions, they all need to be translated. The invoices are not in German. Those are the kind of things that often become more of a problem as you expand deeper into a country, that the actual feature set, because you're building a product that is differentiated. And if you're building SaaS, you're not looking nationally, you're looking international. So this becomes more of an issue when you're building something more niche. And when you're dealing with regulations that differ from country to country, then it becomes a different story. But then you don't have a choice. Then you have to make the product changes. Otherwise, you're not compliant.
Yeah, that's usually, in my experience, the case. Most of the time it's something to do with regulation. But my question is like how to assess if that change to conform to a specific regulation in a country. Because what I've seen sometimes is there's a lot of like work done to be compliant in one single market, but maybe there are others that don't require, that are not that strict regulation and they're much easier, let's say, a more low-hanging fruit. So again, like if you have limited resources, how would you recommend like looking at? And I think it's looking at the potential, yeah.
Yeah, if you're talking market selection, of course, if you have two equal potential markets and one is super regulated, of course, pick the less regulated one. But usually it's not that simple. Usually the more regulated one might have the bigger potential, right? So we're often talking Germany is more regulated. And Germany often has quite a lot of potential because it's not as digitalized as other European countries. It's not as advanced in certain industries. And there's an opportunity to jump in and pick up market share. So that's an equation that needs to be made. But again, in my view, if you are changing the product before you've validated a market, then you're probably not doing it right unless those product changes are relatively easy to make, right? I would not start 3-month product projects to change the product if you haven't validated the market. For me, there's expanding into the market and there's expanding within the market, right? I don't think the product changes should be minimal when you expand into a market. They can then grow when you expand within the market because then you have a direct return and then you start to see it. So for example, with 3D Hubs, when we expanded into Germany, there were certain parts of the logistics and the operations and the checkout and all this kind of stuff that were not in German. But that didn't stop us from expanding because we could still at least see, are we ranking for the words we want to rank for? Are we getting the traffic? Are people uploading parts? And when we talk to people through sales, are we getting traction? Because if the answer is no on those 4 or 5 questions, then you don't want to have spent a lot of time and resources building something for that market if it's not going to work. So you need to validate those first steps first. And then you'll say, oh, well, what we're noticing is the German engineers are really engaging with our website. They're really engaging with our product. They're really engaging with everything. But then when they get to the payment part, where they drop off. And one of our hypotheses, as a product team and a growth team, we have a hypothesis. One of our hypotheses is it's a language problem, right? And then you fix it. Right? But it's a good problem to have. So you want to have that problem.
Yeah, no, makes sense. And we're not advising like a SaaS company for the first international expansion. Like, how do you help them decide between hiring local talent, partnering, like going through partnerships with local teams, or using maybe a remote first, like distributed approach? Is there any like framework or any general recommendation you usually have?
Yeah, there's no framework I use. I think it comes down to a few factors. So number one is relationships. How important are relationships? I think it's as simple as that. If it is a sales-heavy environment where, in quotation marks, the Rolodex matters, you need boots on the ground. You need to find someone. The best way to expand. So if you let's say if you're in something like manufacturing or IT services or medtech, you hire a salesperson who has the contacts, who has the network, because they have the trust, They can get your first clients, and then boots on the ground makes sense. It's something you pay for. It's expensive. But then you really say, okay, we're going in. That's going to be crucial. Because if it's a relationship-driven industry, we're talking long sales cycles, big deal sizes, lots of different touch points needed, that it's difficult expanding. If you're expanding for the first time, it's difficult to do that remotely. Sure, you can have a salesperson who attends the events and drives. Of course, there's a difference if you're driving from Amsterdam to Cologne, or if you're driving from, I don't know, London to Taiwan. Driving, you wouldn't be driving, but traveling from London to Taiwan. So, of course, that also plays a role. But ultimately, it comes down to, if you are in a space that is not very relationship driven, so let's say you're a PLG SaaS, it doesn't matter. That you can do it, that you don't have, that sales doesn't play a big role, relationships don't play a big role. You might still do events, and you might still want to be on the ground to show yourself, to build trust, to build your brand. Absolutely. But you can run a lot of the operations remotely, because what is kind of core to the GTM model of a PLG company is high volume, low deal size, self-serve as much as possible. That's very easy to manage remotely. The more you start going down that the other end of that spectrum, the more you're going towards high touch relationship, the more you want to look at boots on the ground. And boots on the ground can be hiring someone to help build the market, or it can be hiring someone who's already been in the market. And that second one is usually the most expensive, but also the fastest way to validate if this is going to work or not.
And like, what is the most common mistake you see companies do when entering a new market? And do you think there's some way maybe that could have been caught during the research phase before they started like investing in important level of resources?
Well, the most obvious mistake I see is companies just expanding just because, right? So, I'm a Dutch company, so I'm going to expand into Germany because that's what Dutch companies do, right? That's that's one of the biggest mistakes, is let's go to Germany because they super underestimate how hard it can be to expand into Germany. Just because there's a lot of companies that have done it, right? And it still makes sense for a lot of companies, but they do it without doing the research, without really having a reason to expand in that market in particular. So that's kind of the number one mistake. Number two mistake is a very fine line between keeping your original market expansion lean to validate things and making it too lean. What I mean by making it too lean is you AI generate your entire localization and have your half English, half German sales rep who kind of speaks German, but not really super well, cold call a bunch of people. Like, I do see that quite a lot, where they keep it too lean. You want to keep it lean. I mean, this is something where also people disagree on, but if you're too lean in your expansion, it usually fails. And if you don't give it a fair chance of success, I see that quite often. So I often see markets get shut down, market expansion shut down, but this also happens with all kinds of marketing campaigns, actually. Like, you just don't give it a chance to succeed. You go in hoping it's a silver bullet. Like, market expansion is not a silver bullet. It's not a growth hack. Like, and so when companies treat it like a growth hack or an experiment, it usually fails.
And how do you recommend maybe to balance this? Because obviously with AI, a lot of things can be done quicker. And you mentioned that already, like, for example, a lot of things we just click and we get the website translated in the language. How good the translation, how on point with the local pain point is a different matter. But how would you recommend maybe balance it out? Not just because that's maybe too lean, as you said. And I do agree that I see that as well. Like, thinking, and now you just, with AI, you leave it everything to AI and it's going to work. But how do you balance that? Like, how do you think they could find the right balance? Like, giving a minimum, what we usually call a minimum viable experience, that something that will work, but obviously it's not the whole thing. It's something that will allow you to start entering the market, then you build on top of it, because there might be things you need to adjust. It's not just to, because otherwise you end up either spending too much without real research behind it, or too little, and then you don't see results. But I mean, if you were on the other side of it, you will see I've seen some translations that were really ridiculous on websites, and it's like, obviously nobody, especially when we're talking about like a B2B sales, like nobody's going to buy a software that sounds so ridiculous on the main web page. I will think, if I see that in Italian, I will think this company is not really invested in Italy. So what kind of support am I going to get afterwards if that's the, let's say, main window on the word? So
I mean, you also wouldn't use AI just to create your core positioning in English. I mean, some companies do, and they usually don't succeed. So when you translate, that's what you're doing. There's a difference between translation, transcreation. To answer your question specifically, like, the way I would solve this is very clear milestones and steps. So when you look at a market, you have certain expectations of what it's going to take to expand into that market. always do your research. And I don't mean like desk research and Googling. That doesn't really matter. Like, of course, look at what if competitors have done it, look at what they're doing. If there are local players, look at what they're doing. And then talk to a few people in the industry there to understand that industry better, to understand how they operate, to understand what to expect. When you do that, you have a certain expectation of what's going to be needed. So I'll give you the specific example I said before. If you are dominating search, if that is your strategy, that you have a very strong SEO play, right? And you know that is something that you have the resources and the expertise, and it's something that's unique to how you do marketing. You're really good at showing up on Google and LLMs these days, and that's a play that you know. Well, your first step is to validate, can you do that in another country, right? And I'm not saying you should base your entire market expansion on your marketing strategy. And let's take this as an example, because we did this with 3D Ups. We did this. We said, look, we're really good. We know that this high intent keyword stuff works for this industry. And we see that there's a growing search for this in Germany, for example, right? We see there's a growing search for this in Germany. So we need to validate, can we actually rank for those keywords? So we set basically a set of activities and goals for like a first phase. And that was very lean. But we were very clear that if we reach certain goals, so if we start to see we're having sales conversations because people are actually checking us out, well, then that unlocks the next stage of localization. So it's not about lean or not lean. It's about taking it step by step and attaching each step to milestones. They're actually going to unlock that next stage and validate that next stage. And I think that's a way for you to make sure that you don't stay too lean, whilst also not over-investing until you start to see the signals that you need to see. Again, it depends a little bit on your core strategy. I don't think you could change the DNA of a company, right? So I don't think you're going to be, if you're a PLG, I think this is another, going back to the mistake, you'll be like a very, let's say, low-touch company. You have some inbound sales maybe, but it's a lot of self-service. It's quite product-led growth, product-led sales-ish. And then they'll expand into a new market and they'll notice that this is just not working. So then they'll just try an enterprise play in another market. But you're not an enterprise company. So like, I don't think you can change the DNA of your company that easily, and I don't think you should change it for a new market. So yeah, I think that this step-by-step allows you to make sure that the foundations of what make you as a business function or make you as a business unique, that they translate, and then you can invest and build upon it as you go.
Yeah, because otherwise, what you were saying before about you're a PLG and then go to another market and start enterprise, you end up basically with two companies to manage more now, not just one, because they're doing different things, because everything will change around that as well.
Absolutely. And that's also a little bit that again, it depends on the industry, but that's where you can also start a little bit more decentralized and more centralized at the beginning with an internal team validating some core things, and then moving into the market with boots on the ground. So you can also work that into these milestones.
Yeah, in that case, with PLG, you might get even customer success in the, let's say, HQ, but they speak several languages, so they can give support in the different languages that you need. And yeah, and do it gradually. I like the idea that, as you mentioned, it sounds like a video game, like unlocking new levels. You start with a small experience, you unlock the next one. I really like that idea. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always how we've done it. I've not always done it like that by design, like is now looking back, but that's how we've always done it. Is that like this basic, like this market is interesting because of assumption 1, 2, 3, 4. So I need to validate assumption 1, 2, 3, 4 in order to validate that the market is as interesting as I think. And then I can basically make a schedule and set milestones for validating those assumptions.
Oh yeah, what I mean specifically is like the way it sounded like you're gamifying the whole experience. So that's,
absolutely. Really nice. Yeah. It also stops you from investing way too much into a market that basically is dud for you.
Yeah, because I've seen cases where there was, let's say, overinvestment and the cost of acquisition was too high in an international market because maybe for different reasons. And at the end, the company decides to pull out. And it's a shame in that case because maybe you invested so much, or they end up having like a sinking cost. So they say, we're already invested so much, so we need to invest more to stay there. And that becomes like a bleeding bucket. So it's
also because market expansion is often done for the wrong reasons, right? Market expansion is best when you say, we've built this awesome thing and we're killing it in our home market. So let's go into new markets and take over. Very often what I see is companies say, we're struggling in our home market, so maybe if we try this there, it'll work. Like, that rarely works.
Yeah.
So pre-product market fit companies expanding into new markets happens all the time, and it's kind of crazy.
And I think with the possibility given by AI, that I think accelerated much more this trend, which I agree doesn't really work. Yeah, because it sounds so easy. It makes it sound so easy that then a lot of companies try before they're ready for that. And to sum it up, if you could give one piece of advice to a SaaS founder that is making the first international expansion decision, what advice would you give them?
One advice I would give a SaaS founder want to expand into a new market. I guess the advice would be what I just said, which is break it down into steps. Break down the market expansion into stages. So like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and make sure that you are very clear on what you're willing to invest to make this happen. Like, don't treat experimentation is a fundamental part of market expansion. You absolutely have to experiment to expand into a market successfully, but market expansion itself is not an experiment. It's too big, too ambitious, too complex to be just an experiment. Right? So if your quarter is Q3, expand into this market, like no, Q3, OKR, begin the market expansion. Phase 1 of testing market X, that's a legit OKR. But expanded to DACH as Q4 OKR, I see that all the time. That's not a correct OKR because then you're underestimating it. I think market expansion is a huge lever for growth if you nail it, but it can also be a huge time suck and a huge waste of resources if you don't do it right. So I think that's be very clear on what you're willing to invest to make it work and then take it step by step.
I think that's a really good advice to close on. So thank you so much, Ferdinand, for joining us today.
Thank you, Nicola. Appreciate it. Anytime.
Thanks for joining us today. The Multilingual Content Podcast is powered by Undertow. We help B2B SaaS companies grow in any language. Get in touch if you want to know more. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episode. If you want to support us, remember to give 5 stars to the podcast. See you next time.